Join me inside my writing yurt. Come on. Our second question today comes from Mahalia W. And she asks, when do we use affect that starts with an A, and when do we use affect that starts with an E? In other words, what's the difference between affect and effect? Now notice, if you're just listening, you wouldn't necessarily know there is any difference there. Affect with an A sounds the same as affect with an E. However, we use these two words differently when we speak and when we write. Now, I want to step back one moment and remind you, or at least share with you, something that Marie says at the very beginning of the Basic Cozy Grammar course. There she observes that we speak differently in different contexts or different circumstances. For instance, if she's talking with her friends, talking colloquially, she doesn't worry about grammar. Maybe even if she's writing to her friends, she's not particularly concerned about being grammatically correct. However, there are circumstances when it is very important to speak grammatically and to write grammatically. For instance, if we are writing a letter for a job application, we want to write as grammatically and correctly and interestingly as we can. Now, this is where the difference between a word like affect with an A and affect with an E becomes very important. Now, I have a very simple rule which helps me remember which word to use when. This is how the rule works. Affect with an A is a verb, meaning it's an action word. That story affected me deeply. It moved me deeply. If I say something like that, I'm using the word affect as a verb. That story affected me deeply. Now notice that a verb is an action word, and the word action begins with the letter A. That's how I remember that affect with an A is an action word, because affect with an A also begins with an A. Now contrast that to the word affect with an E. Affect with an E is the result of something, maybe the result of an action. So for instance, they lit the theater with dark blue lights. The effect was very dramatic. Here, affect is a noun. It's a thing. It's the result of the lighting that they brought into the theater. Now notice that the word result has an E in it. No A, E. So that reminds me that an effect with an E is a result or a thing, a noun. These are two simple mnemonic devices. That simply means a device or a tool or a technique or a trick that we use to remind ourselves of something. These are two mnemonic devices that you can use to help remind yourself when we use affect with an A and when we use affect with an E. Now, of course, there are other uses of the words affect and effect, and we could go into those in greater detail if we had more time. But like Marie demonstrates in her courses, and like I try to continue in her courses, the way to learn grammar or punctuation or spelling or writing for that matter is to take things one step at a time. Then you become more and more confident in your use of language, in your ability to write, in your ability to speak effectively, grammatically, and persuasively. And then as you get into the higher realms of grammar or punctuation and so on, you don't get lost because you have a solid foundation to build on. So that's my set of rules for building a solid foundation for distinguishing between words such as affect and effect. So thank you again, Mahalia W., for your excellent question.